Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here today. For those of you who know who we are, this is, I think, our fourth Power Breakfast within the last couple of months. We've talked on enterprise IT as a service, Department of Energy, GWAX, BIX, and Max, oh my. So for those of you who know us, you know that Lisa Chamont, Amber Hart, we're all about providing you real, tangible information that has to do with contract spending, agency information, and analysis. So you will get these slides after the fact, so don't feel like you need to stand up and take the picture like we all do on your phone. We have a lot of information, and we sort of come at you with a fire hose on this. So when you do get the slides, just please don't resell it. That's all that says. The pulse of... We don't make money off of that, so, but I don't want you to either, to repackage and sell our research. But the Pulse, if you were to steal from anybody, we are a research and advisory firm. We're dedicated to the empowerment of government contractors. We do federal consulting, training, and we also have a membership platform. But we are here to talk about DOJ. So for those of you that know us, you know that we're all about providing context and the research behind the customers that we interact with every day. So Department of Justice began in 1789 with a staff of 2. Now the operational staff is more than 115,000 employees. It's comprised of approximately 40 separate organizations, and that includes 9 principal components, 2 boards, 8 divisions, and 24 offices. So that's who we're dealing with when we're talking about working with the Department of Justice. Now, what breakdown of those 117,000 personnel within DOJ, over 60% of them actually support FBI and BOP, which you can see in that chart over there. It's really the majority of it. Followed by the Office of Boards and Divisions, we have DEA, we have the Marshal Service, we have Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, we have Office of Justice Programs, and then Asset Forfeiture up at the very top. Now, out of those people, approximately 50% down in this other chart here, thank you, Vanna White, are paralegals, financial managers, procurement officers, evidence technicians, and security specialists. And that's followed by, what do we have over there? Agents, correctional officers, attorneys, and intel analysts. Now, the resources span across 5 major program areas, including law enforcement, litigation and compensation, prisons and detention, grants, executive oversight, and enterprise technology. So those are the people. And you can see this chart over here is going to talk about how DOJ actually acquires and procures those goods and services from us, the government contractors. Now, the Justice Management Division, or the JMD, that is actually the principal organization responsible for the management and administrative support in DOJ. And so Amber will be able to point to that over there on the org chart. Under JMD is the Procurement Services Staff, PSS, and the Office of Acquisition Management, OAM. And so those are the people that you would typically go to sell to. They're responsible for annually $1 billion in expenditures under contract and task order deliveries. That's the PSS. And then the Office of Acquisition Management supports the Chief Acquisition Officer and Senior Procurement Executive. They are designated as the DOJ Competition Advocate. That's important for us government contractors, the Competition Advocate. And that's actually just made up of 3 individuals, and they drive the entire acquisition policy and compliance for the agency. And now everybody sort of procures a little bit differently here. You can see that we have 2 industry liaison and acquisition innovation advocates in DOJ. We have 9 bureau procurement chiefs, 179 contracting officers, and 752 purchase card holders. So depending on who you're targeting and what you're selling would depend on who you reach out to there. There's some specialty areas over here too. So DEA has field offices that have limited procurement authority. That's limited to SAP transactions. And then BOP, each facility is responsible for buying their own supplies. And they do that through, and I think it's the central office's business office, COBO. They are responsible for local acquisitions for that central office. So that's who DOJ is, and that's what they do. So now Amber is going to give you the rundown on how they have been spending and the trends for the upcoming year.
Okay, I need the microphone. So just talking about a few spending trends, breaking down the numbers. I know a few people in the audience have asked our two previous kind of panelists about what that spending looks like in socioeconomic spending, small business. We're going to get into that. But just as a breakdown, we went ahead and looked at the data over the last 5 fiscal years, kind of with the administrations changing. And DOJ's total contract obligations have only increased by about 2.9% year over year, just to kind of give you an idea of where that's going. So it looks pretty steady. They've been pretty steady across the board. But if you look at the changes when it comes to the actual bureaus and offices and the 9 components, those have changed drastically over the 5 years, which we show here. OJP, the Office of Justice Programs, has actually increased by 82% year over year in requirements and contract obligations. ODP with 29% year over year. The OIG office, 23%, ATF with 21%, USMS, so the Marshal Service, with 18%, DEA then dropping down to only 3%, FBI actually has had a negative 8% in growth year over the past 5 fiscal years. And then federal prisons actually had a negative 12% in fiscal years as well. And that has a lot to do with administration priorities. So looking at buying categories, we've kind of broken down the top PSC and NAGS codes for everyone. The biggest, as you can see in this breakdown here, this is FY21 category spending. We have not provided the FY22 numbers because they're not all fully in, so that's why we're providing FY21. But as you can see, the biggest category of spending that DOJ does get from our vendor community is professional services. In FY21, that was about 43% of all of their requirements and contract obligations. That was followed by IT services, which was around 28%, medical at 10, facilities and construction around 10, and then everything else kind of up here making up the rest of the percentage. We're going to break down this chart for you guys in the next slide, but just to talk about what kind of requirements they are buying, you can see the typical top PSCs and the NAGS codes. I won't read out those really long numbers for you. But the top one being R499 for PSCs and 541, 519, kind of a catch-all for computer-related services. The kind of typical requirements that you see a lot when you're breaking down what they're buying are things like languages services, so stuff like translations, transcription, interpretation services, IT and telecommunication services and equipment to include satellite communications, hazardous waste removal, moving services, construction, facilities operations and maintenance, litigation services, of course, training, law enforcement and equipment, transportation services and equipment, and things like firearms and ammunition. So a lot of things that you would expect to find across a broad agency like this. So looking at the place of performance, so where does DOJ typically execute their performance? 20% of all DOJ requirements are performed in this lovely area of Washington, D.C. and Virginia. Other locations that you can find them in is Texas, California, Maryland, West Virginia, and Alabama, where a majority of those CONUS requirements are executed. OCONUS locations are Canada, Mexico, Somalia, Albania, and South Korea. So looking at the vendors, so in FY21, DOJ worked with about close to 8,000 vendors across around 26,000 contracts. So we provide kind of the top vendor breakdown over the past 5 fiscal years there. The top vendor being the Corrections Corporation of America. Makes a lot of sense. The GEO Group, Management and Training Corporation, Booz Allen, Leidos, SAIC, Mantech, NAFCare, CGI Federal, and On Assignment. For those looking for those subcontractor opportunities, like the OSTBU director said, can you raise your hand if you work for these vendors? Don't be shy. I know some of you are in this room. I know you are. Raise your hand. Nice and high. You need your subcontracting numbers. There you go. All right. And then looking at grants as well, because grants is a large part of justice. We provided kind of the states that get a lot of those breakdowns. So California being the top, Texas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, New York, Massachusetts, and then Foundation Systems and Anchors, Inc., which does work with the Federal Prisons Bureau. No. So a lot of the grants that come through DOJ are actually more in the rehabilitation and vocational support and training services, but those are actually starting to increase in things like just training for inclusive diversity requirements throughout Department of Justice, civil and law enforcement training as well, with a big push through the administration. And a lot of those dollars that have come through things like the Infrastructure Act and other funding that have passed through COVID actually has passed through as grants funding, not contract funding, which nonprofits and for-profit companies such as yourselves can actually bid on through grants.gov. So that's a different funding mechanism that is being used. So if you're in that more of that training human capital area and you're looking to get into Department of Justice, that might be a good area to look at as we're kind of going through this CR and function with this current Congress. So over the past 5 fiscal years, just breaking down competition, I know someone actually asked about consolidated and bundled requirements. So we kind of touched on that right around here. So you can actually see how that has grown within the Department of Justice. So around 70% of all DOJ requirements have been competed. So that's supposed to be competed, not completed. And around 66 million a year of requirements are bundled and consolidated on average. So that actually impacts things like construction projects, IT projects, small businesses, and competition. So around $66 million a year, DOJ is consolidating and bundling. And then out of all the socioeconomic designations, 8A vendors are the most popular with DOJ, with over 31.8% utilization over the past 5 fiscal years. But you can see a breakdown of all of those socioeconomic categories right here. We also broke down a lot of the vehicles that DOJ likes to use, and that says DHS, not sure why. Those vehicles are GSA Mass with $5 billion, GSA IT-70 with $5 billion as well, NASA SOUP being $3 billion, GSA PSS, which has been brought up to GSA Mass, but that's still kind of in transition, with $1 billion, and then Alliant being $1 billion. And those are the top vehicles that DOJ has utilized over the past 5 fiscal years. So looking at what's to come, right? The president's budget right now has a top line increase of over 6% to the Department of Justice, raising it to $37.6 billion in discretionary funds. So that actually is funding that is accessible to everyone in the government contracting community. It's very much focused on law enforcement functions. If you've been paying attention to the news and what the administration is pushing for, that shouldn't surprise you. The FBI is getting $10 billion if they get their way. U.S. attorneys with $2.8 billion, DEA with $2.5, Marshals with $1.8 billion, and ATF with $1.7 billion. And there is an increase in available grant funds for state and local law enforcement entities on the topics that I touched on earlier. We also provided some of the strategic priorities, which was released by Department of Justice. They just released their 5-year plan of their new updated strategic priorities. A lot of them are a little bit fluffy, frou-frou. These would be so nice, but they are helpful in understanding kind of where they're going, which is upholding the rule of law by combating pandemic fraud. If you haven't been following the most recent procurement fraud team stood up by the Department of Justice, I absolutely recommend checking that out. It is a team of federal employees that are working it, but there is contractor support that is always utilized, and they have been doing really good work in kind of identifying that fraud, tracking it down, and doing kind of things like asset forfeiture work through that. Addressing violent crime, combating ransomware attacks, obviously that's been a big topic of discussion today. Protecting civil rights by combating hate crimes, and promoting trust and accountability in law enforcement, ensuring economic opportunity and fairness by reinvigorating antitrust enforcement and consumer protection, and improving the administration of immigration courts is also a big push that they work with HHS pretty closely on. So that was all of our data for you guys.
Thank you. So grants, yes. That is a hobby horse subject of particularly you, I believe. So when we all think of grants, right, this is when I get to brag on my brother, as I did at one of our previous events. He works in public health. So when I think of grants, and maybe some of us think of grants, it's academia, philanthropy and research. And oh, by the way, for-profits. Would you say that they are underutilized by for-profit contractors? Please take the floor.
So we like to bring up grants because, especially for small businesses that are trying to enter a specific customer base, and they always say, well, how do I get in here? And obviously you subcontract, you get the past performance, like we've all heard the best practices. But what not enough people do is actually leverage the grants that are available. They're a smaller dollar value typically, but it's a great way to get that past performance with a customer agency that you might not previously have. Same thing with challenges. Always go to challenge.gov and see what sort of challenges agencies are putting out. Again, it's not huge amounts of money, but it's just a great way to get your foot in the door.
Yeah, and from a budgetary standpoint, if you're asking, well, what's really the difference? So grant money is actually allocated and appropriated by Congress differently and through the funding mechanisms. So during a CR, there may be, such as what we're in kind of now and might be in for a little bit, there is funding that can be still passed through and that is shared by Congress, appropriations for grants that can kind of flow through differently than the discretionary funding. So it's always a different revenue and access to take, so I'd always recommend looking at that because it's a little bit more available.
And I'll pass this back to you. How about some quick do's and don'ts for explaining and pitching myself to agency X, in this case Justice, why I should get grant money?
Just in general, I mean, best practice is always to just do your homework, have your research done in advance. You know, the Pulse likes to preach about looking at historical spending for the contracting officers that you're targeting. Say, hey, I've seen that you've spent X amount here through this acquisition strategy. Here's how we can be an ally to you, how we can be a partner, how we can be an asset to a process that you're already engaging. And so just always having that homework done in advance. We all know that, yes, you need to be persistent. As Amber would say, be pleasantly persistent. She was called a bulldog by, I believe, GSA back in her sales days. This one right here. But you have to be persistent and pleasant with that sort of information in your back pocket, too. You can't just send your capability sheet via email and expect it to go anywhere.
Yeah, and grants are taking a different turn. I think the government's looking at them a little bit differently now, too, as academia kind of is expanding or non-traditional contractors are getting more involved. And justice, especially with this administration, is really being pushed to look at things that used to be a little bit more grant or human capital, friendly, right? Which is training on diversity, inclusion, doing training for law enforcement on things, that are prevalent, which are things like hate crimes, or focusing on active training for different ways to treat communities. A lot of those things are getting out there, and there's a lot of ways that I think the government's looking to bring both vendors and those not-for-profits that do that type of stuff or are active in those communities together to go after that type of work. And I think that's really appealing to a place like Department of Justice right now to kind of bring that business-like mentality with that type of nonprofit community-focused flavor right now.
Okay, switching to actual government contracts, although grants, very important, right? Let's take that home and remember that Amber said they're underutilized, so I'm holding you to it. What explains the heavy utilization? You had the chart earlier of 8A businesses being heavily utilized, and there's never more than one reason why something is a thing in government contracting, but do you have any thoughts or takeaways as to why that is? Okay, someone's grabbing it.
They're the easiest thing to access in a contracting shop that may be smallly manned right now, if that's the most politically correct answer I have. There is a lack of resources, especially within the Department of Justice contracting shop right now, where a lot of things are outsourced, and getting access to that type of community and understanding is just easy, right? 8A's love you all. An easy button right now for the government, right? Especially as you don't have the resources. And when you look at things like where they spend money on construction and professional services and these more kind of support roles within the Department of Justice, 8As are very easy to access through those types of requirements. And it's an easy thing to kind of put under the $2 million mark and put under the rule of 2.
In entering or trying to enter this market with the rule of 2, if 2 or more small businesses demonstrate they can do the work essentially, right, then it will be set aside for small businesses. So how do I then, whether I'm large, medium, or small, go in to...
What do you find we have?
So DOJ, if you're looking for a rule of 2 right now, there is an RFI that was literally released yesterday. It's for the U.S. State Marshal Services. It is for their information security program. It was released under GSA eBuy. There is an RFI right out, but I think they're looking to put it out small business. So if everyone in this room, if you're a small business, responds to it and has the capability, you will meet the rule of 2. So your homework is to find another small business in here, make sure you all can match this, and then go after it and everyone respond, and then it can go small. It's, just so you all know, it's called the Information Security Support Services under GSA eBuy. It's, GSA actually put out the RFI, but it's for Department of Justice.
And that's why you follow the pulse, because we are always talking about the new opportunities that are being released. And you asked, well, how do you make it small? And it is by responding to things like RFIs and market research.
Do you want the RFQ number? You guys want the RFQ number? I have it for you.
when you find it. So while Amber is looking that up, I would like to hear Lisa hammer a point home that 2 of our other speakers addressed earlier. Respond to the request for information. Go.
Yes, and look, I get it, because we've worked on the proposal side and we've worked for contractors, and it can be a hard pill to swallow to put together an RFI response depending on the requirements of that RFI, because there might not be anything as a return on investment for you. We know you're spending B&P dollars to put together a piece of documentation, send it out when you don't even know if there's going to be any funds allocated to that contract. And if it is, it might not come out for 1, 2, 3, or never, years. It's just one of those things. But it is so important, and the more contracting officers that we speak to, the more that they say they rely so heavily on that. And so my advice is, when putting together RFIs, it's give a little bit of yourself, not your entire secret sauce. Give just enough, and always provide an acquisition strategy within an RFI response, even if they don't require it. Because the easier that you can make it for your customers, the better it's going to be. And the more you can shape it to things that you have. So acquisition strategy, those schedules, those contracts that you hold, say, hey, here's why it makes sense for you, contracting officer, to release this information through this method. Oh, we got an Ostabu.
Hi.
Could I add something here?
Sure.
Thank you for saying what you said, but I wanted to add something here too. If by chance you see an RFI, an RFP that is like a mini proposal, they're wanting a proposal out of you and not performing market research. That's what my office is for, because we want to streamline that for all of you, so that we're asking you only the basics, so we can make, among other reasons for market research, but from my perspective, we can make a set-aside decision or not. So please, if it's too lengthy, that's why you call Ostabu. That's why we're there. We can tighten up that procurement office and the program office to be more succinct in what they're asking for, so they can get the answers they need. Yeah. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to finish your thought, or do you? Oh.
Yeah. Something else about RFIs that I think is interesting, people are always like, well, I'm not compliant with the RFI requirements. And I say, well, what do you mean you're not compliant? It's not a contract. Like, in some ways, who cares? I don't meet all 10 of these points here. All right, fill it out anyway. Say why you don't meet those points. It's not a real contract, so compliance it's different. You obviously want to follow directions and you want to show, because that's what, all of these solicitations are, is just an exercise in following directions. Really, guys. So, if you know, you know. It's a formulaic thing. You're following instructions. They want to see that you know how to put your name on the top of the test, right? And you'll get points for that. So yeah, if you don't meet all of the requirements of an RFI response, I hate small businesses that say, well, I don't meet this. All right, well, show what you do meet.
Like a job, put like a job application. You meet like 25% of it, shoot your shot. Why not? Just first things first, and then I just want to follow up on that. RFQ number, for those that are tracking, is RFQ 1597810. I feel like a bingo caller. I'm going to say that one more time. 1597810. Okay, and then just one follow-up to why responding to market research is important is because as a business owner, we get putting your time into things that you don't really have any ROI on. But I want to challenge everyone to also think creatively about those responses. Those things can serve as then turning them into white papers, turning them into your capabilities briefs, turning them into content for your website, helping your team come up with solutions and then pocketing those for a rainy day when you're going after something. There are so many ways to utilize responses to market research that I don't think a lot of people look at as far as it being so time intensive. And then another thing, if you're looking at it from a sales point, is put that in your Outlook as, hey, follow up on this, and then now you have a new contact to follow up on with someone that you know that is buying something that you're potentially selling.
See what happens when you come to our events, right? I didn't even ask a question there. I just said respond, Amber grabs the mic, the speaker makes a last cameo.
It's great.
It's great. Any quick questions from the audience? Yes. So I'll summarize the question really quickly. It's RFIs that are really something else. Something else. Yeah.
Well, so you have to kind of consider all RFIs as phase one, right? Like it versus actually being invited to compete on something like you would in a phase one down select. You sort of have to assume, and that's what contracting officers have said to us in the past too. They've said, if you don't respond to the RFI, I don't know that you can go after this bid. And so that's why it's also imperative to just put in your responses to those, even if you think, oh, I'm just going to wait for the RFP, because you wait for the RFP, you might not get an opportunity.
I'm not really a tattletale per se or a narc, but what I would say is if it does occur, that's where your OSTBU office, I would also say, comes into play. If you're seeing that occur enough as far as something that is blocking you out, where it's like, hey, so they technically and legally don't have to tell you that, and which is very frustrating as a vendor community. I would say to make sure that if you are in touch with the end user and that has happened to you and excluded you, let them know, because sometimes those on the project or end user side will then voice their opinion depending on their poll. You can also request to be added to that down select. Now, sometimes you don't find out till later, but if you, we've had clients many a time find out about something that got released to a certain subset, and then we've just we've told them to reach back out and ask them, and they've been included. So, I would say always try to get included, ask, and if there's still a pushback as to no, and they say it's because of a source of sought, I would try to go to an office that is advocating for you and let them know that, hey, this is occurring. Because competition is what the goal is, right, and mitigating risk and having those people.
But yeah, I mean, people are invited to bid on contracts, and it does not need to be legally just put out to the public. And that's sort of, yeah, we know, e-buy, like that's part of the problem with procurement, but neither here nor there.
What's e-buy?
What's e-buy? eBuy.gov is the source where GSA schedule holders are able to access the task orders and bid on them that come out under those schedules. But you can only on eBuy access the task orders that are released under the schedule that you hold, under the SINs that you hold. Under the contract that you hold. So it's a down-selected amount of folks that can view the task orders, and then even then, you're not necessarily getting the full picture if you don't have access to the other SINs.
And you can even down select from that down select list, as what was mentioned, where people can just select and invite the vendors on there. So it's just it's a way of the government making sure, or vetting previously, that you have the prices to back up what you're bidding, basically.
I've never seen this thing called eBuy. It's just this magical, mystical world that I hope to see one day. What explains the flattish curve in contract spend over the past 5 years? Because you mentioned it's around 2.5%. And just for context for this, not including this recent period of crazy inflation, 40 years between 1960 and onward, 4%. Yeah. Just for context.
How am I supposed to explain? I don't. I'm not an economic advisor, but what I assume and what I do see is that it's due to justice has always been kind of a pretty level, steady place for funding, and one of the obviously their biggest drivers and their biggest revenue producer is for corrections in prisons and BOP, and so that what. Steady crime, steady putting people in jail and having to manage them. And so that is that has kind of kept them steady because of the spending that supports that division. That kind of keeps, if it makes any sense, that kind of keeps every other requirement at bay, right? Like they very rarely, like IT spend supports the BOP at times and things like that. So it's hard to kind of get over that hump of big, massive spending because unless justice heavily invests in something that's going to be bigger than the corrections and prisons bureau, it's hard to make that jump over that type of increase.
The toughest question I had for you will be my final one, unless there's any quick ones from the audience. Yes, sir.
No, they weren't even on there.
So maybe talk qualitatively about hub zone trends, topics, anything you can share.
So just across the government, hub zone has always been the difficult get for whatever reason. We've seen hub zone contractors that have access to it, and maybe truthfully it's because it just in terms of the numbers, people aren't saying, hey, we're a hub zone and we have these capabilities, or they're not responding to the RFIs. People aren't necessarily driving the work to the hub zone set-asides. But, I mean, just statistically, that's always been the issue across the government, reaching that hub zone.
Yeah, and there wasn't hub zone on that chart, right? And because they don't have really, it was being asked, someone, he's looking for hub zone vendors. There might be several reasons why that's not showing up. My guess is, the 8A utilization is so high that some of those might be hub zone vendors as well, that they're just being counted as 8A. I think, that's a problem with the system, and that's a conversation for another day. But I think, because professional services and construction are pretty big buys, and a lot of, as we mentioned, 66 million is consolidated every year throughout Department of Justice. I think a lot of those opportunities for firms like hub zones are kind of being taken away either because 8As are just the easy push for professional services or construction, or the IT services that could be supported by hub zone firms are being consolidated under vehicles that either A, they don't have access to, or B, the requirements now have been bundled to be too large that a hub zone can't prime that work.
So for everyone here, just get your office space, move to downtown Leesburg. It's beautiful. It's a hub zone.
Get a postal zip code. There you go. We're talking small. Just move one person.
So we could spend half a morning talking about government data, but we're not going to do that. That may be for another event, but thank you very much. And until next time, for both of you, thank you.